Today we are looking at top DPS specs in Mythic Plus, but not really the top DPS specs in Mythic Plus, more like the ones that could have a chance at being very good based on number one, the current damage they are doing in keys, number two, the popularity of these specs at the very highest of keys, so being run by the big boys doing plus 14s or plus 15s right now, because we are seeing some specs doing very well despite not being very popular right now amongst the more general population. So we're not talking about balance, we're not talking about ret or fire mage or enhancement shaman. We're talking about more niche specs, and the first one in line is the niche spec of Unholy. We're talking about Unholy because ever since week 1 Unholy was in the top of the damage done in Mythic Plus keys, and then now week 2 it's actually even further ahead than the other DPS specs. Now the curious thing, let's see if you can draw a pattern of what's going down here in this Mythic Plus build for Unholy. The pattern of these talents right here: Apocalypse, Magus of the Dead, Menacing Magus, Army of the Dead, Raise Abomination, as well as All Will Serve, Unholy Pact, and Raptor Viscera. Well, what is the pattern amongst all of these things linked together is that they are all pet talents, and they are all not being taken. This is a danger we touched in the PTR coming up to this patch, the possible new top build of Unholy, Sun Lane overtaking Rider and going basically no pet talents. Back then the worry was the mega single target damage of Death Coil, which was since nerfed by a little bit, but it's still very good. Now though, the problem is a different one. The problem is that looking at these top 14, 15 level keys with Unholy DKs blasting is the fact that most of their damage won't really be coming from your pets or from your summons. Yes, technically these are results without taking pet talents, but even your generic ghouls won't really be doing much. What will be much more viable will be your just blanket AoE and, more importantly, your Blood Beast. However, what perhaps might not put Unholy that much in the radar of very top level keys is the fact that when we go back and look at actual AoE, so big pool, 50 seconds, all cooldowns, this is what happens. What happens is that Unholy has 23 million DPS. And the reason why it gets to this much DPS is because the Beast has come out. The Beast has come out to do 8.5 million DPS by itself. Now the Beast actually is a bait, it's not the actual Beast doing the damage, the Beast does nothing. Where the damage is actually from is from the explosion. The fact that the Beast will soak up a portion of the damage for 10 seconds and then will blow up, and that's what is a lot of the damage. Whereas the somewhat perhaps unlucky part is that sometimes it is also RNG, because if we look at another DK, in practically what is the same pool, the first Shreddinator 3000 in Floodgate, you will see that now the damage is 17 million and that there is no Blood Beast, because it just did not proc. Your Blood Beast isn't guaranteed. It comes from the chance of turning your Scourge Strike into a Vampiric Strike, and then Vampiric Strike itself will summon the Blood Beast again, with a chance to summon the Blood Beast. So you have to go through this chance and then into this chance to get the Blood Beast, and then you have to hope that the enemies stay alive for long enough, at least 10 seconds, for the pop to happen at the end. So when that doesn't happen, the damage sinks dramatically. Guess what happens once this actually pops? Well, I wonder what is this damage gap. The damage gap is the 7 million DPS done by the Blood Beast in this pool, which is practically the same gap you have between the Destro Lock and the DK. That's the current situation for Unholy. Very high AoE damage, albeit tied to the RNG of your Sun Lane build, your no pet Sun Lane build in Mythic Plus. That's the thing right now. But overall, we can see that even if it is RNG, we can still see the data, that the data overall is telling us that the damage is still very good. So it is doing quite well. Of course, the other thing that was worth mentioning about Unholy is that this is the switcheroo compared to last season, because if we go back to the War Within Season 1, the one that was meta was Frost, not Unholy. So we have gotten the turnaround where now Unholy is the better performing between the two specs, visible also in the popularity of the specs in Mythic Plus from 12 keys. If you start going from 12 to 13, the gap is even larger, and then from 13 to 14, it's gargantuan, and Unholy is actually the second most run of the melee in 14 plus keys. So this one is the first highlight of the day, right now the current performance of Unholy. However, we have to talk, right as we see right here, fresh from the presses, one of the first timed 16 key being done is the other melee spec in the spotlight, because unlike Unholy, it's not nearly as popular even in these high keys, but still popular in the toppest of keys. So these level of keys, these level of 15 completed keys and the first 16 completed right now, which is Subtlety Rogue, which is right here, technically just as popular, actually less popular than Feral, slightly less popular than even Arms Warrior. And technically, even in the damage itself, you would not even think that this one was even the better one amongst the other rogue specs. But it is doing very well right now. Now, unlike Unholy, there aren't really any surprises in how Subtlety plays, in the sense that it is still playing with Trickster. The perhaps biggest, counterintuitive thing about Subtlety is that even in Mythic Plus, even in what you would think is an AoE situation, you still play with single target, almost single target rotation, because your Shadow Strike is very heavily tied to your Trickster talents. To proc Unseen Blade, you want to use Shadow Strike, more so than getting phased on targets to give you 5% more damage, to give you 10% more crit chance, to give you 50% more critical strike damage to phase targets, because all of this will be pretty much done all the time by your secret technique anyways. You want this to proc your coup de grace, to give you 5 stacks of Flawless Form, which gives you 15% more damage to your finishers, which is what you care about. The only thing you want to do, if you really want to min-max, is to cycle a couple of times, one Shadow Strike and one Shuriken Storm, to benefit from the damage increase of attack, giving you 6% more damage to your abilities. But beyond that, it does roughly the same. It still has the same benefit of being one of the strongest burst specs in the game on a fixed 90-second cooldown, because you are practically lining up an entire arsenal of buttons. You're lining up, here is your flagellation, and then you put on your trinket, which you can't even see showing up because it's right below your flagellation, and then your shadow blades, which is again on top of your trinket, which is on top of your flagellation. And even if you want, you can min-max even more to go for Subtlety, which also gets dunked on top of these buttons as well. To make this even more important and valuable this season, your tier set this season for Subtlety is even more focused on your cooldown, because your 4-piece now stops the chance of you losing your win streak when you are inside of Shadow Dance, which is like all of your damage window. And each time you would gain an extra stack of winning streak, you gain 6% more shadow damage. And you have a piling on of damage boosts with these cooldowns all together. The main stat from your trinket, the 20% more damage from Shadow Blades, also giving you full combo points every generator, which make you cast way more spenders, and that's more mastery value, because your mastery gives you more damage to your spenders. And finally, flagellation, flat out giving you more mastery for more finisher damage. All of this makes for very powerful 90-second windows for Subtlety. Yes, the non-windows outside of these cooldowns, it makes the spec a bit weaker. It doesn't have any cheats to recoup some of that damage in some kind of procs, some kind of band-aids to fix it. But the damage still remains acceptable enough, also thanks to the mega buffed Nimble Flurry, which used to be 15% of your damage being cleaved. It has since been buffed all the way up to 60%, which is one of the major reasons to give you this constant passive damage that you have in your keys in AoE. You do also still have, being Sub-Rogue, the massive benefit of having one of the better funnel abilities in the game, because you have the existence of Shuriken Storm, which gives you 1 combo point per target hit. So if you're fighting 6 or 7 mobs, but they are all smallies, they are all clowns, dying to just random cleave of an Ignite spreading Fire Mage, an Elemental Shaman using Earthquake and Chain Lightning, what you can do is simply use them to funnel your single target damage, which is one of the best funnels in the game. provided the enemies are stacked and it's not some kind of spread multi-dotting cleave, which is very good, of course, in Mythic Plus, because unlike the raid, in Mythic Plus, much more often you will have targets with 6 times the HP of others, which are the perfect target for a sub-rogue to funnel to target specifically while they do accidental AoE damage with things like Secret Technique or things like Nimble Flurry, while they are focusing a specific target, thanks to their funnel. That is still very valuable in Mythic Plus. So despite their current overall popularity not being very high, even in considering all Mythic Plus key levels, sub is like very, very low. They are currently a very powerful spec in Mythic Plus. We are, with this, however, done with the melee. Now it's time to talk about the range DPS, and we start with Elemental Shaman. Now, Elemental Shaman is not exactly on the low end of popularity, we can say. It's not exactly a niche hipster spec, to be fair, but as you go, starting to go in 12 plus levels, you still have mages and balanced druids comfortably ahead of Elemental, and if you were to combine the warlocks and the hunters, they would match Elemental as well. And even here, even in the super top keys, it's not that Elemental is super popular. Yes, you see some blue, but it's not all Elemental. As a matter of fact, there is only a handful of Elemental Shamans being run anyways. Their damage is good, the damage is still very good, as you see here, just like Unholy being quite high. Elemental, unlike Sub being deceptively low, is pumping some pretty good damage in Mythic Plus. Now, unlike other specs, they do have a weakness, perhaps even more pronounced than Unholy, which is their single target. Now, admittedly, this is a bit unfair because the single target in a fight like Swamp Face is a bit harder for an Elemental Shaman to pilot a movement-heavy fight like Swamp Face. Even on a 2-target fight, perhaps with a bit less movement where you can plant a bit more, it's not that strong. The power of Elemental is how they can be consistent in their damage, pull by pull. And what that means is they have the option, so to speak, to choose when to dump their cooldowns and how many of them in which pulls. This has been a very good improvement to the Elemental, talent setup for Mythic Plus, which has vastly been granted by their tier set. The power of the tier set of Elemental comes from the fact that your 2-piece set bonus now has a chance to spawn your Elemental. That is very good because the Elemental spawned from the tier set still benefits from every talent that buffs Elementals in this tree. So, whenever the tier set procs the Elemental, you now do 10% more damage because you have Elemental Unity. Also, the duration is not 8 seconds, it will be buffed by 20% because of Everlasting Elements. Also, once the small duration Elemental procced from the tier set expires, you still get the small one from Echo of the Elementals, and both of which will still be buffed up by Primal Elementalist. What makes this very good is that this proc of the Elemental is also confirmed 100% happening when you use Ascendance. This gives you the possibility, if you want to sort of desync your Elemental and your Ascendance, which is already somewhat annoying to do, to put them together, since Ascendance has a 3 or 2 minute cooldown and the Elemental has a 2.5 minute cooldown, but thanks to your tier set giving you a Storm Elemental anyways when you use Ascendance, you can kind of just off-sync them if you need to, depending on the size of the pulls. Is it a type of dungeon where you're pulling 3 enemies and then 4 and then 5 and then 6 and then 5 and then 4, so they are quite consistent in their size? It is better to stagger the cooldowns. Is the type of dungeon where you're pulling 5 enemies and then 2 and then 15 and then 3 and then 5 and 6 and then another 15? Then for those pulls, it's better to pair them together. It's a very powerful tool for Elemental to be able to choose to spread your Ascendance, your Storm Elemental, thanks to the existence of your 2-piece set bonus, giving you an Elemental when you use Ascendance. And then to also continue the power of being able to have consistent damage, the 2-piece can also proc by itself. So you can get your 9.6 seconds long Elemental without having to use Ascendance, which will still significantly help your damage done on top of your already existing bursts of damage thanks to playing Stormbringer, thanks to playing Tempest. it does make it a very good spec for Mythic Plus for their AoE damage. If you remember the complaints about the utility of Resto Shaman in the first month of Season 1 of this expansion, well, pretty much all of that is still here for Elemental Shaman when it comes to utility. They still have that as Shamans in Season 2. Their major weaknesses being the fact that they are very weak to moving as Stormbringer. Casting Tempest and casting Elemental Blast is very problematic on high movement fights, and they are absolutely terrible at only fighting 2 to 3 targets. Their cleave or small target number damage as Stormbringer is not particularly good, but it remains a very high overall damage spec in Mythic Plus, particularly if, as mentioned, the meta will continue to steer towards a Vengeance Demon Hunter, wanting more casters in the comp. Then Elemental has a good chance at becoming more relevant because of this, caster comp compositions. We have, however, one more caster comp to add to this possibility, part of the range DPS gang, which is not actually Destruction, it's Demo Warlock. So the relevancy of Demo Warlock is that compared to last week, Demo Locks have already doubled in popularity already in Mythic Plus. So there has been a rise of the spec in keys. Now, Demo's damage is very good. Demo's damage in single target is not that great. It's not as weak as Elemental's damage, but their power level as Demo is the fact that they have, as you can see here, very consistent damage. If you compare this overall damage with the one of Elemental, it's quite a stark difference in how often do they get to have their damage. Well, the very simple answer to this is that Elemental is trying to juggle a 3-minute cooldown, a 2.5-minute cooldown, and the proc from their tier set, which is a smaller burst of damage. Whereas for Demo, they have a 1-minute cooldown Tyrant, which makes it available, of course, very often. So it makes it easier as a spec to have better uses for your cooldowns. Just 1-minute Tyrant on CD and pair it every other use with your 2-minute Felguard. Now, Demo also has a similar help like Elemental for their consistent damage. On top of the consistent damage granted by Diabolist, granted by the Diabolic Ritual, is pretty much across the key. You can see the damage here of Diabolic Ritual. It's very consistent across the entire key. The extra help is the Dreadstalker. Sorry, Greater Dreadstalker. Practically a 2-piece set bonus worth 8% of your damage alone in Mythic Plus. And very similar to Elemental, while the 2-piece of Elemental straight up summons basically your own Storm Elemental, this one summoning a Greater Dreadstalker, it still functions the exact same way as your normal Dreadstalker, meaning every one of the buffs you have in your talents, for example, for your Dreadstalkers, like for example being able to have their Dreadbite do AoE damage, doing more damage with it anyways, having a chance to double hit with Dreadbite, pretty much all of these buffs still go on the Greater Dreadstalker of your tier set. So it's a very good help for your consistent damage between the Greater Dreadstalker plus the Diabolic Ritual extra damage, and being able to have a constant 1-minute CD of your Tyrant, which of course does absolutely 0 damage. You don't actually care about the damage of your Tyrant. What you care about is that the Tyrant extends all of your demons by 10 seconds, plus gives them 15% more damage, plus of course playing Diabolist, you get an extra 20% damage to your demons when you have your Tyrant active. So it's a major cooldown for your other pets, and it is only on a 60-second cooldown. If you wanted even more consistent damage in AoE, you also have now your Charhound. Now you have it much more powerful than before. More consistent AoE damage, pretty much always active. So it is somewhat different from what we have just seen when it comes to Elemental, in terms of Demo having far weaker bursts of damage compared to Elemental. They barely ever reach 7.5 million damage, basically once with Lust in AoE, whereas Elemental can comfortably reach pretty much every time they pop their cooldowns that number. Same goes for Sub. Their 90-second burst cooldown windows are not nearly as powerful as the one we mentioned for Unholy DK, with their new sort of non-pet damage. This looks very small simply because the initial one was gigantic. but the burst windows are quite large for Unholy and quite large for Elemental as well. More consistent are the ones for Demo, which, being caster, as we mentioned, can benefit if we fall more towards a caster comp centered around Vengeance, with things like Mage, things like Balance, possibly Shadow Priest if you don't have a Discipline Priest. If you do have the Disc Priest, then you can move over to use another caster. At the moment you still have, as we already mentioned, some of the other popular ones like Beast Mastery Hunter still being played quite a bunch, or even things like Monks, things like even some Warriors sneak in. That's kind of what happens in the first weeks of Mythic Plus, but I thought it was interesting to go over some of the less talked about specs doing well right now in Mythic Plus, particularly towards the high level of keys right now. In case you were wondering why exactly some of these groups are running these specs, despite some of them, in particular Demo or something like Sub-Rogue or something even like Unholy, not showing up nearly as much as some of the other specs, namely BM, Mage, Balance Druid, for example. This is why. That's the current power of these 4 specs we just saw for today: Unholy, Subtlety, Elemental, and Demo. High chance they still won't pass some of the more popular specs right now, but they have been doing well enough that it was worth keeping an eye on them as the meta for Mythic Plus develops in Season 2. So, for today, on this Saturday, with the rain in the background for like 5 days straight, it is now time to leave each other. We're starting, as usual, the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I'm perfectly fine with it. Just keep the rain going, maybe have a 10 to 20 minute break every time I have to go out, and then we are good to go.